Good morning. Good morning and welcome. I am very pleased to see you all here and to welcome you to the 17th Annual Welfare Research and Evaluation Conference. My name is Naomi Goldstein. I'm the Director of the Office of Planning, Research, and Evaluation in the Administration for Children and Families. It is now 79 years since the passage of the Social Security Act in 1935, 50 years since the beginning of the War on Poverty, and in more recent history, it's nearly 18 years since the passage of the Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Reconciliation Act of 1996. The cohort of children born in that year is now approaching high school graduation and the age of majority. I'm pretty sure we haven't solved all the problems that TANF and related programs are meant to address, but I hope and believe we have continued to learn, both to generate and to use knowledge about the families who use TANF or might need it, and about the effectiveness of various programs and approaches to help them form stable marriages and families, care for their children, and gain and keep employment. I also hope that we're on a path toward a culture of learning in the organizations we work in. Rather than expecting that once we finish the current study, we'll finally have the answers and be ready to put them into practice, I hope we can think of continual learning as an essential part of our work. And toward that end, with Mark Greenberg's encouragement and leadership, ACF has established an evaluation policy. The policy is not a departure from past practice, but it aims to clarify, disseminate, bolster, and protect ACF's commitment to creating and using evidence. The policy sets forth 5 key principles: rigor, relevance, transparency, independence, and ethics. Am I handling the slides? Or is somebody else? Maybe with this? Pardon? Point it, okay. There we go. Clarify, disseminate, bolster, and protect. 5 key principles, and I just want to say a word about each. So rigor is worth dwelling on. I have 2 slides for rigor. Part of the point of rigor is to make sure that we have internal validity, which is, in my view, a technical way of saying getting as close to the truth as possible. We also need external validity, or at least we need to be aware of how generalizable our findings are. We need to match the right methods to the question that we have, and we need to be aware that rigor applies to all types of methods. Rigor is not just a code word for random assignment. We need to be rigorous when we use random assignment. We also need to be rigorous when we do qualitative research, descriptive research, quasi-experimental designs. We need to be rigorous no matter what approach we're using. And of course, our efforts at rigor have to be tempered by cost and feasibility. We need to do the best we can with the resources that we have. One of the ways that, well, the main way that we get to rigor is through the people who are carrying out the research. So that means it's very important to recruit and maintain a talented federal workforce, and it's very gratifying to work with the very talented people at the Office of Planning, Research, and Evaluation. We try to make the work rewarding, and we try to offer opportunities for professional development so that we won't just attract talented people, but keep them as well. And then we are very dependent on a private research sector. We are very dependent, completely dependent really, on the contractors and grantees who carry out the work. So we aim to be very careful about how we select those contractors and grantees. Sometimes we try to fund work that will bolster capacity in the research sector, and we try to provide careful oversight, which again, in respect to the staff at OPRE, it's really a leadership function. And they do it very well. We try to make our work relevant. Rigor is great, but if we're not asking questions that are important, that we've developed in consultation with stakeholders and in partnership with our program office colleagues, then it's just a thing of beauty that's not really going to be of use. We aim to recognize the diversity of the populations we study and to seek to encourage diversity in the researchers who carry out the work. We have tried, especially in the last several years, to really up our game in terms of dissemination so that we can make the work easily accessible and usable by our partners. We try to build evaluation planning into innovation early in the process so that it's not an afterthought. And again, we aim for a continuous cycle of learning. It's never over. We aim for transparency. And this conference is one of the ways that we publicize our work. We make sure that we let the interested public know when we initiate a new study. That's a way of keeping us honest and making sure that the results are awaited and can never be suppressed or hidden. We have a policy to release our results timely and comprehensively. So we release the results whether they are favorable or unfavorable, whether they are null, whether they are expected, unexpected, surprising, or confusing. I am often in a position of telling people that we don't make this stuff up, and you know we don't make it up, because if we did, it would be a lot simpler than the actual results that we often find. We describe our methods, and we typically archive our data so that it can be available for other researchers to use. Independence is our fourth principle. So independence means that we aim for objectivity, we aim to avoid bias and undue political influence, and I want to make a distinction. In the selection of evaluation priorities and questions, I think that political influence is entirely appropriate. We work in the executive branch. The president appoints political appointees to lead our agencies. They are in charge of setting policy directions, and they ought to be heavily influencing the questions that we're asking. But they ought not to be influencing the design of the evaluation, the conduct of the evaluation, or the analysis of the data. We award our contracts and grants competitively. We avoid conflicts of interest, and our evaluation policy states that we in the evaluation office have the authority to release results. And that's very important. I actually have never been in a position where political leadership has tried to suppress results, but I hope never to be. And having a stated evaluation policy is one protection against that. Research ethics, when you're working with human subjects, is a complicated and subtle and very important arena, and for now, all I'm going to say is yes, we aim to comply with both the letter and the spirit of research ethics, principles, laws, and regulations. So throughout the conference, and I especially want to highlight at our closing plenary on Friday, we will hear from people who have exemplified these principles. And on Friday, we will hear from some pioneers in applying rigorous methods to social policy research. They will discuss 40 years of randomized experimentation in welfare policy and practice. I will be there, and I hope you will be too. This is a good moment also to mention the retirement of Nancy Campbell, a valued and beloved colleague whose 38 years of federal service coincide with these 40 years of flowering of rigorous experimentation in the welfare field, and she had a lot to do with it. I'm not sure if she is here now, but many of you know her, and I hope you'll take a chance during the course of the next few days to wish her well in her retirement. Between now and the closing session, you can choose from among over 35 conference sessions, each one rigorous, relevant, and rewarding in its own way. This year's conference has over 1,000 registrants, a record number. You come from all over the country and beyond, 43 states, 2 U.S. territories, and England. You can enrich and expand the conversation through social media, and we encourage you to do that. You can tweet with the hashtag REC2014 to share what you're learning. And just a reminder, if you want us to see your tweets, you have to take your settings off private. And if you want us to retweet your tweets, you have to make them respectful, accurate, appropriate, and interesting. You can participate in a virtual roundtable discussion by joining our LinkedIn group. And this year we've added a mobile website. It's very cool. At wrconference.net, you can quickly get all the information you need about the conference on your smartphone and tablet. We'll be live streaming every plenary, every breakout session that takes place in this room. And we especially invite our live stream viewers to connect with the rest of us using these social media tools. You can send questions to panelists by email at reclivestream@gmail.com, by tweeting with the hashtag RecLive, or directly on the live stream site through the Submit a Question function. We also have old-fashioned networking opportunities in person, and I want to ask you to take an opportunity for 3 minutes to find someone at your table or nearby that you don't already know and introduce yourself. 3 minutes, I'll call you back when it's over. I'm always surprised when you actually do it. I'm always surprised when they actually do
Yeah,
this.
oh no, and I think it's a good way for people to get started. One just logistic question. When I get started, will my face be showing up there?
You know what? I'm going to ask them not to do that because I hate that.
Yeah. Okay.
To see you. Okay. Okay, time to stop. This is the hard part, getting you to stop. It's time to stop. Time to stop networking. We will have more networking opportunities throughout the conference. Time to stop. So, on tomorrow at 12:30, we'll have a lunchtime panel discussion on careers in research related to poverty, family self-sufficiency, and social welfare. It's open to all conference attendees, and it will feature panelists with experience working in federal and local government, research firms, and academia. On Wednesday afternoon, 2:45 to 4, we'll have a poster session with emerging scholars. The posters will be displayed in the foyer throughout the conference starting this afternoon, but the scheduled poster session is a chance to talk with the emerging scholars who'll be on hand to answer questions about their work. Tomorrow at 5:15 in the Grand Slam Sports Bar here at the Grand Hyatt will be an informal social gathering. Please join us and feel free to buy yourself any refreshments that you would like. On Thursday, 11:45 to 12:45, Munch and Mingle lunch gathering. You are invited to buy your own lunch, bring it, and gather in the back of this room for informal networking and discussion. And on Thursday from 2:30 to 3:45, we'll have facilitated roundtables on a range of topics, and you can find the specific topics and the location of each roundtable in your program book. When you enter on the lagoon level, at the bottom of the escalators, there's a booth displaying information about the Office of Planning, Research, and Evaluation, and you can sign up there for the OPRE newsletter if you don't already subscribe. We publish every 2 weeks with news about recent reports, funding opportunities, and upcoming events. There's also a booth for the Self-Sufficiency Research Clearinghouse. ICF International developed this clearinghouse with a grant from us as a repository of information and a hub to promote knowledge sharing among a broad range of stakeholders. The kiosk is located in the Independence Foyer, and you can take the clearinghouse for a test ride there. So, thinking about the future, I want to announce that after this year's conference, we're going to move to a biannual schedule for the Welfare Research and Evaluation Conference. So our next gathering will be in 2016. This schedule will allow us more time to prepare for the conference and identify high-quality research. We are working with our colleagues in the Office of Family Assistance to develop focused activities for the off years, and we welcome your ideas about that. With this move to a biannual schedule, we also plan to take a step back and think about what the REC has become over the past 17 years and what we want it to look like in the future. With that in mind, we welcome your ideas about a new name for the conference. We hope you'll give us your best thinking. You can buttonhole us in the hallways or share your ideas on the conference evaluation form. I want to thank our Family Self-Sufficiency Research Technical Work Group, whose ideas we rely on in planning this event and our research portfolio. Their names are listed in the conference program, and many of them are here today and throughout the conference. OPRE staff and fellows who planned this conference include Mark Fuccello, the Director of the Division of Economic Independence, Hilary Forster, Erica Zieluski, Tiffany McCormick, Jason Despain, Akbar Hussain, Brock McIntosh, and Jacob Wellman. And again, they're here, and you can identify them by their name tags throughout the conference. And our logistics contractor, ESI, Jennifer Pinder, Annie Oliver, and Michelle Rasper have made everything go smoothly, and they're probably not in the room, more likely they're out at the registration table. So it's now my privilege to introduce Mark Greenberg. Mark is my boss. He's the Acting Assistant Secretary for Children and Families. He's also the Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary and the Acting Commissioner for the Administration on Children, Youth, and Families. Yes, he's doing 3 jobs, and he's still made time to join us here to open the conference. He'll be with us for the closing plenary as well. I've worked closely with Mark for about 6 years, and I can say that this behavior is typical for him, exemplifying both his commitment to learning and his support for those who work for him. Putting those 2 qualities together, he's been a great friend and advocate for OPRE and for our work. Before joining HHS, Mark directed the Georgetown University Center on Poverty, Inequality, and Public Policy. He's been a senior fellow at the Center for American Progress and directed the center's Task Force on Poverty. He was also a senior fellow and director of policy at the Center for Law and Social Policy. Before coming to DC, Mark worked at Jacksonville Area Legal Aid in Florida and the Western Center on Law and Poverty in Los Angeles. Before that, he graduated from Harvard College and Harvard Law School. And before all of that, Mark was a first grader at Daniel Boone Elementary School in University City, Missouri. I have comments from Mark's first grade teacher, Ms. Ernestine Harper. She wrote, "Mark is a conscientious student, is eager to learn, works very earnestly, and is ready to challenge any statement which may seem doubtful to him because he wants to be absolutely certain of his information." So, Mark, Ms. Harper had you pegged. We have all benefited from your lifelong commitment to getting things right, and it is my pleasure to introduce you.
So thanks very much, Naomi, and thanks, everybody. Naomi did warn me that she was going to use the quote from my first grade teacher. I do appreciate it. I actually think that that's the characteristic described as a valuable one for a federal official or a researcher or an advocate. I do appreciate it may not have been entirely appreciated in the context of a first grade class. But it is striking to certainly to see and hear it after all those years. And per that comment, I actually do want to note when Naomi talked about our evaluation policy, it is right that Naomi and I spent time talking about the need to have a clearly articulated evaluation policy and to put it out publicly and put it on the web And my principal role in that process was to say, I think it would be great for us to do this, and in addition to that, to emphasize the importance of transparency and independence in the work of OPRE, and to put this forward in a way that is available to the public for the future. So I do just want to begin by very quickly reciprocating Naomi's kind words. I've been part of ACF now since 2009. Over that period, one of the things that I've most valued and appreciated has been the opportunity to work with Naomi and the OPRE staff. The OPRE staff brings analytic rigor to everything that they do. At the same time, it is a group of people who are thoughtful, insightful, deeply committed to identifying the ways in which research and evaluation can promote better policy and practice, and their contributions to our work are invaluable. And a very large part of the quality of OPRE's work is directly attributable to Naomi's leadership and Naomi's judgment. So I would like just the OPRE staff to just stand for a moment to be recognized. So again, thank you all very much. So, and thanks to all of you for joining us for this 17th annual convening of the REC. I've actually had the opportunity to participate in most of the prior 16 conferences. I can actually recall being at the first one in 1998. I remember being on a panel then. As best as I can recall, the essence of our discussion was that it appeared that the TANF caseload was going down a lot and rapidly, and that there needed to be some research about that. Over the years since then, of course, that research did happen, admittedly still leaving some important questions never fully answered, but over the subsequent years, the REC has grown steadily, and this year we have over 900 registrants, possibly approaching 1,000 registrants, along with a large audience across the country, connecting through live streaming and social media. And as I'll talk about in a moment, the topics and the focus and priority have necessarily continued to evolve with the passage of time. As some questions have been answered, some new ones have come forward, and new challenges and issues have emerged. Those of you who've been here before know that the REC brings together a diverse audience to hear about new and emerging research in TANF and employment policy and child and youth well-being and family strengthening, responsible fatherhood, strengthening the safety net, and the conference brings together researchers and program administrators and policy officials and others. We're particularly pleased to be able to host over 40 state and local TANF representatives and to welcome attendees from 43 states, DC, 2 territories, and the UK. In the next few minutes, I won't seek to summarize the entire agenda for this year's REC, but I do want to highlight several themes and topics and say a bit about why we've included them. First, economic mobility. In an important speech last December, President Obama said that addressing inequality and economic mobility and opportunity is the defining challenge of our time. Cross-national research suggested a principal reason why economic mobility is not as strong in the U.S. as in a number of other developed nations is because our bottom fifth here is less likely to move up. A set of ACF programs play an important role in efforts to improve economic mobility in the U.S., including our early childhood efforts, marriage, fatherhood, and teen pregnancy prevention efforts, the work to help less skilled adults succeed and move up in the workforce, the work to promote effective transitions for youth. At the same time, we at ACF are trying to better understand the most important policy levers and approaches to improve economic mobility for low-income individuals and families. And shortly, you'll hear a discussion of a range of ideas on this topic. Later in the conference, we'll be holding another session on the question of what factors matter in economic mobility. As we look at the mobility issues, I want to emphasize that addressing mobility and addressing poverty aren't identical, but they are closely related. Research tells us that children growing up in the bottom quintile, for children growing up in the bottom quintile, over 40% will remain there as adults. So on the one hand, that tells us that birth isn't destiny, that most children that grow up in poverty don't remain there as adults, and that most poor adults don't grow up in poverty. At the same time, it also tells us that children growing up in poverty are much more likely to be poor than any other group, and that most children growing up poor do remain in the bottom half. All this points to the premise that any strategy for addressing and improving mobility in the United States has to include a focus on addressing sustained and persistent poverty and its impacts on children. Second, we've got a plenary session later today on the research relating to executive functioning and its potential relevance to our efforts. Those of you who attended last year's REC may recall the plenary session we did on toxic stress, the body of work indicating that when a child experiences strong, frequent, or prolonged adversity without adequate adult support, the prolonged stress can disrupt development of brain architecture and other organ systems, and it can increase the risk of disease and cognitive impairments well into the adult years. In the last several years, we've been very aware of, in some cases, very involved in the discussions about trauma affecting children and adults, the roles of trauma-informed care, discussions about the impacts of toxic stress, and the potential for strengthening the capacities of adults to prevent it. Discussions about the importance of conceptualizing programs as two-generational programs and the implications for program design, and the discussions of parenting and relationship education and the roles of non-cognitive skills, and of course the work around executive function. We see all those bodies of work as related, and at ACF we've asked OPRE to help us think through how these bodies of work do and don't fit together, and what are the implications for program, practice, technical assistance, and our research agenda. We're intrigued by the hypotheses that stronger attention to executive functioning could lead to better results in efforts to help adults succeed in employment, and that doing so also could improve their capacities to succeed in parenting, in relationships, in maintaining focus on goals and future plannings, and in managing conflict and stress across multiple domains of activity. At the same time, we recognize that there are critical questions about what's meant by executive function, how to measure it, how to improve it. Is there, in fact, evidence that generating improvements in executive functioning would translate to improvements in employment or parenting or other outcomes? So we will explore this both in today's plenary and in related sessions and work over time. Third, regular attendees to the REC know that ACF is strongly committed to strengthening the research base about strategies to help less skilled adults enter and retain employment and progress in the workforce. One key aspect of that work concerns the research relating to career pathways, connected education and training strategies and support services that enable individuals to secure the industry-recognized credentials, obtain employment within an occupational area, advance to higher levels of future education and employment in that area. We hope that you have seen the joint request for information that was issued by the Departments of Labor, Education, and HHS, inviting state and local policymakers and practitioners to describe their efforts and to help us identify the most important ways in which the federal government can assist those efforts through research, technical assistance, and policy development. ACF's engaged in two groundbreaking evaluations of career pathways approaches to training low-income individuals: the Innovative Strategies for Increasing Self-Sufficiency Project, ISIS, and the Health Professions Opportunity Grants Program, HPOG. These complementary, long-term, rigorous evaluations will provide much-needed evidence about how these strategies support economic self-sufficiency for low-income individuals. And for the TANF administrators in the audience, we think that both ISIS and HPOG have important implications for strengthening attention to skill building in TANF. You'll hear more about these projects through the conference. Along with the career pathways work, we continue to be strongly committed to building the research base and providing needed technical assistance to support state and local efforts to implement and expand subsidized employment. As many of you know, experience around subsidized employment goes back many years. There are multiple models and approaches, but the rigorous experimental base is quite limited. We're seeking to expand that research base through the Subsidized and Transitional Employment Demonstration, STED. A number of TANF administrators were involved in the experience of the TANF Emergency Contingency Fund under the Recovery Act. Using ECF dollars, Emergency Contingency Fund dollars, states launched the largest subsidized employment effort in the United States since the 1970s. 42 states established programs, an estimated 260,000 job slots created for adults and youth, many involving subsidies with private sector employers. We and many others had viewed those subsidized employment efforts as an enormously positive development, in which the funds were used to help workers and businesses and communities. We sought to encourage continued state efforts even after the ECF funding ended, but we recognized that many states had difficulty sustaining those efforts when the Recovery Act did end, given that TANF block grants are now back at their 1997 funding levels. The President's 2015 budget request includes a Pathways to Jobs initiative within TANF, which would repurpose the balance of the TANF Contingency Fund to support work opportunities through subsidized employment, which would increase the dedicated resources for these efforts. And in the STED evaluation, we hope to gain valuable insights to inform policy and practice and to lead to more effective strategies in subsidized employment strategies for working not just with TANF recipients, but also with non-custodial parents, individuals leaving prison, disconnected youth, and other youth at risk. And you'll hear more about our research in this area tomorrow. So in the last few minutes, I've only touched on a fraction of what's going to be covered at the conference. You'll also note, among other things, significant attention to the potential for behavioral economics to help human service agencies. You'll see a set of sessions relating to how to improve services for and conduct research with tribal populations. A set of sessions relating to fatherhood and family formation, improving outcomes for foster care youth, and other disadvantaged populations of young people. And there will be a presentation of new research about disconnection, the group of families who are not in work and not in welfare. And in designing the evaluation, we've sought to strike a balance and to have a conference that offers significant value to program administrators and policymakers and researchers. As you hear many times, this administration is strongly committed to evidence-based policymaking. The REC is an important example of a conference which is designed to advance such efforts. So we thank you for attending, and we very much look forward to the next 3 days. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Mark. So I would now like to invite our panelists for our first plenary to come on up to the podium. We have a distinguished group here to share their thoughts on concrete policy actions that can improve economic mobility and opportunity for low-income families. My colleague from ACF, Jeannie Chaffin, Director of the Office of Community Services, will lead this moderated discussion, which will include Ida Rademacher of the Corporation for Enterprise Development, Greg Och of the Urban Institute, and Aparna Mathur of the American Enterprise Institute. For those of you watching on live stream, I want to remind you that you can ask questions during the Q&A period by sending an email to reclivestream@gmail.com, tweeting with the hashtag RecLive, or using the Submit a Question function on the live stream site. And with that, I turn it over to Jeannie. Thank you.
Good morning. So thank you, Naomi, and all the staff at the Office of Planning, Research, and Evaluation for organizing this panel today. It's very timely and I think a very hot topic that people enjoy hearing about this morning. As Mark and Naomi were talking about the work of OPRE, I was thinking about a couple of calls I've received in the last couple of weeks from federal colleagues and partners saying, is there still time to register for the REC conference? I think this conference has such a stellar reputation and people really count on it as a great learning opportunity, and that's demonstrated over and over by people really showing a great desire to come to this meeting. So I'm very pleased to be here, and I'm very appreciative to our panelists for coming this morning and being a part of this initial event. So this year marks the 50th anniversary of President Lyndon Johnson's declaration of an unconditional war on poverty and unemployment. And like President Obama today, President Johnson emphasized every hardworking American should have the same opportunity to succeed. Johnson's war on poverty created an opportunity, as he said many times. The programs created would be about providing a hand up, not a handout. And while likely we all agree that we've much more work to do, we've made progress and learned a lot about reducing poverty and creating opportunity. The Johnson administration pushed through Congress some of the most impactful social welfare legislation of our nation's history, allowing for first-time federal investments in education, health, housing, justice, and economic opportunity. The many pieces of legislation passed had significant success in a range of areas, including reducing senior poverty, reducing infant mortality, and an area of often overlooked success, reducing racial injustice. One main example of this came after the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, when the Johnson administration applied pressure on local governments and private organizations, tying receipt of federal funding with the requirements to desegregate housing, schools, and community health facilities. There have been many gains, but we must do more to bridge the opportunity gap, for we know too well that many are being left on the sidelines, which all too often includes racial and ethnic minorities, including African Americans, Latinos, and Native Americans. When we look at intergenerational mobility for many of these groups, we find unacceptable results. Jared Bernstein with the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities and a former economic advisor for the White House spoke at ACF last month and provided some additional thoughtful analysis when explaining that while many are debating whether we've won or lost the war on poverty, that really is the wrong question to be asking. Mr. Bernstein proposed the problem is not the ineffectiveness of the anti-poverty programs. It's that these programs have had to work much harder in an economy that has made it a lot tougher for those at the bottom to get ahead. And we're going to talk more with our panelists today about what some of those problems have been over the course of the last 50 years and today. We know we've made gains as seen in recent research using the supplemental poverty measure. Between 1967 and 2012, poverty fell by almost 40%. The advantage of 50 years and new measurement tools like the supplemental poverty measure help us to evaluate more accurately the impact of the strategies, policies, and programs we've deployed in the last 50 years. And now we find ourselves planning policies and strategies for a different economy and future. The economy is not functioning as a rising tides lift all boats, as designers of the war on poverty had expected. We are now in a time when our current president has declared that addressing inequality and economic mobility and ensuring that our economy works for all is the defining challenge of this time. The Pew Charitable Trust, as part of their work on economic mobility, indicates 43% of Americans raised at the bottom of the income ladder remain stuck there as adults, and 70% never make it to the middle. And those Americans raised at the top of the economic ladder are highly likely to remain there as adults. It's a phenomenon that Pew often calls stickiness at the ends. The president has indicated we can expect this administration to focus on changing this stickiness phenomenon and has laid out an opportunity agenda to help all hardworking, optimistic kids and adults in America have the same chance America gave him. Researchers are learning more and more about what causes the stickiness at the ends and the factors that promote upward mobility. Understanding the factors that promote or discourage intergenerational mobility will help us to determine which policy and program levers to pull. We can benefit from thinking about the range of factors and the intersections between factors. There are factors related to the economy with its growing inequality, its emphasis on high-skilled jobs and high unemployment. These often interact with family factors. Family and demographic factors such as the promotion and support of education, race, family employment patterns, and savings are a few factors that researchers have been looking at. And finally, community and place, safety and segregation play a role in upward mobility. The mother working a low-wage fast food job who does not have sufficient time or the financial resources to supplement her child's education with enriching after-school or summer activities is experiencing an interplay between mobility factors, opportunity, and possibly even growing inequality. A young, low-skilled, unemployed father living in a certain location in this country may find very low mobility as compared to other communities that might be out west. What policy interventions should we put in place now that will allow this mother and father to fully contribute their gifts and talents and make sure their children do better 30 years from now? The panelists here today have studied, written, and promoted creative solutions for promoting increased economic mobility. I'd like to share a little bit about their background, and then we're going to have some initial questions from the stage, and then open it up to questions from the audience. We have microphones around the room, and we're going to invite you to ask questions. We know this is a very hot topic, economic mobility, and we know that you will be very interested in having a very open discussion about this topic this morning. So I'm going to introduce our panelists. Gregory Otch is director of the Urban Institute's Income and Benefits Policy Center. His research focuses on issues of social insurance, social welfare, and the compensation of workers. Recently, he completed a study of the factors contributing to persistently high unemployment in the United States and policy responses to that problem. In addition, Dr. Otch has studied the low-wage labor market, changes in welfare policies and how they have affected welfare caseloads, and the well-being of low-income families, and how state and federal policies affect the incentives families face as they move from welfare to work. He is the author and co-author of numerous scholarly journal articles, policy papers, and briefs, and reports to federal agencies. Aparna Mathur is a research fellow in economic policy at the American Enterprise Institute. Her fields of specialization are applied microeconomics, the labor market, international finance, and econometrics. She has published in several academic journals and published several National Bureau of Economic Research working papers, including most recently a paper with Abby McCloskey on welfare and workfare reforms that foster upward economic mobility in the United States. Her work has been cited in popular media such as The Economist, Wall Street Journal, and Business Week. Dr. Mathur has testified at a number of times before congressional committees for her expertise in economic issues, including most recently a joint economic committee hearing on income inequality. Ida Rademacher is the Corporation for Enterprise Chief Program Officer. In this capacity, she provides strategic direction and leadership to CFED's program, policy, and research teams, and oversees the successful implementation of the strategic plan. She also serves as a key spokesperson for CFED and works closely with a range of partners from public, private, philanthropic, and nonprofit sectors to design, implement, evaluate, and scale proven strategies that expand financial security for low and moderate income Americans. So I'd like to begin our discussion by asking each of our panelists for approximately 5 minutes to talk to us about concrete policy actions or programs that they believe will improve mobility for low-income families. Greg, would you like to start?
Good morning, and thank you for not sharing my first grade teacher's evaluation with me. So, when you're talking about economic mobility, it's important to remember that in the absence of economic growth, mobility is a zero-sum game. So for someone to move up from the bottom, someone else has to move down from the top, and that's a tough sell. So I think the right policy question is, what policies can promote economic growth and empower those at the bottom to benefit from that growth? So first we should start with asking, we've had growth. Why haven't the benefits of that growth affected everyone in the income distribution? Why haven't the benefits of growth really affected the bottom? And there's no single reason why the bottom is so sticky. Rather, there are myriad self-reinforcing reasons. So let's contrast the experience of a child born to a single mother with a high school education or less with a child born to a married couple with college degrees. So, between the stress of meeting life's basic necessities and our own educational and experiential limitations, that single mother may not be able to provide the same type of home environment that is as emotionally and cognitively nurturing as the environment provided by the middle-income couple. When the child gets to school, he's not as ready to learn as a child from a middle-income family. When he struggles with his classwork, he can't get the same level of parental support and help. And so at each step of the way, he's falling farther and farther behind. Think about the greater context that the child lives in. His school, his neighborhood probably aren't providing the same level of opportunities for learning and constructive engagement as that enjoyed by his middle-class contemporaries. Now, high school graduations are pretty good these days, up around about 80%. But even if this child makes it to college, he's not necessarily prepared to succeed when he gets there. So is it really surprising that kids born into poverty have trouble climbing up the economic ladder? Is it really surprising then that hardship in one generation begets hardship in the next? So essentially what we have is a segment of the population that is not equipped to benefit from a growing economy. And given the number of interconnected challenges faced by low-income families, no single policy is going to be able to move the needle that much. And so that brings us back to the framing question: how do we promote shared economic growth? And I think you need a two-pronged strategy. We have to develop a more skilled and adaptable workforce, and we have to strengthen the social institutions to ensure that workers benefit from their enhanced skills, that they get a fair return on their investments in their human capital, if you want me to sound like an economist. So let's go back to that child born in poverty. There are many steps along the road to take that child born in poverty all the way up to an economically independent adult. And at every life stage, we can improve that child's chances by a little bit. Each single step, very small, but cumulatively, we can have a quite sizable effect. So some specific examples. So in early childhood, the home instruction of parents of preschool youngsters program, HIPPY, I don't know who thought of the acronym, but I like it. It's a home visiting program that trains parents to be effective teachers to their kids, and it's been rigorously evaluated and shown to improve reading scores and reduce hyperactive behavior. We know that high-quality, center-based preschool improves kids' reading and math scores. At elementary school, programs like social emotional learning and the Success for All program have modest but significant effects on cognitive skills and behavior. For teenagers, the Talent Development program has positive impacts on reading and math. And then as kids near the end of high school, We can provide multiple paths to skill acquisition and the transition into the workforce. For some, financial aid and a traditional four-year college will, in fact, be the best route, but it can't be the only route. So alternative programs like career academies, programs like Year Up, apprenticeships that link skill-based learning with employers with jobs are an important pathway to getting kids into higher levels of skills and higher levels of jobs. Our community colleges can serve both as springboards to four-year education, four-year college degrees, but also if they're working in partnership with local employers to provide the skills and training that local employers are demanding, then those attending the community college will have the skills for the jobs that employers are looking for, and that's a coordination issue. So no one program is enough. We need consistent efforts. Now, how is a more skilled workforce going to lead to a growing economy? Well, employers and entrepreneurs are smart, right? They also want to make money. You give them a better resource, you give them a more skilled workforce, they'll figure out how to use it, they'll figure out how to grow the economy. The question then comes, will that growing economy, will the benefits of that growth accrue to those newly skilled workers? And I think that's where social institutions come in, and that's a little harder to think about policies that everyone can get behind. So, collective bargaining, the union movement, the labor movement has been declining. Perhaps stronger negotiating positions of workers might help them benefit from their new skills. We have a tax code that preferentially treats income accrued to capital in the form of capital gains and interest as opposed to labor income. We might want to rethink that. We can also think about public expenditures benefiting communities to take things off the balance sheets of low-income families so that they have more money to spend on other things. Think about better parks, better schools, safer streets, community-level Wi-Fi. So in short, improving economic mobility for low-income families is going to require concerted, long-term efforts to improve the skills of the workforce, a growing economy, and social institutions that help workers with those improving skills capture the benefits of that growth. Thank you.
Thank you, Greg. That was very clear and concise, and I know we'll want to follow up on some of those issues here in a moment. But before we do that, Aparna, would you like to take it on next?
Sure. Thank you, Jeannie, and thank you, Greg, for your comments. This is a really interesting topic to study, to work on, talk about economic mobility. It's something that we all care about. We care not just about income inequality as it exists today, but the impact of that on our children, of future generations, and how poverty could persist across generations. And I think now we have the benefit of a lot of research out there on the topic. What are the correlates of economic mobility? We can't say these are causal factors. We don't know. It would be impossible as an economist to predict, if we change this particular factor, we would see improvements in economic mobility. But we do know from the benefit of research that has been coming out, as recently as a couple of months back, that there are certain factors, there are certain social factors, there are certain institutional factors that are correlated highly with economic mobility across the U.S. When you look at places across the U.S., they show different trends in economic mobility, and so we can look at that and see what factors we think might help the process and might help poor income families move up. So one of the most interesting and I think the most significantly correlated factors with economic mobility is family structures. We've seen a decline in the traditional family over the last 40 years, starting in the 1970s, 1980s. There's been a decline in traditional two-parent families and an increase, a nearly doubling of shares of single parents, particularly single mothers. And single mothers tend to have much higher poverty rates than traditional two-parent families. And that leads to a persistence across generations in the economic outcomes for the children, because as Greg pointed out, when single mothers try to manage both the educational investments in their children, try to manage their work and life balances. There tends to be a trade-off. So one of the, in the report that you mentioned, Jeannie, that I've done with Abby McCloskey, we talk about how do we help single mothers in poverty. Now, institutionally, we believe that traditional families are better. We see the economic outcomes being better for two-parent families, but there's a limit to how much we can control that. So how do we do, what policies can we put forward to help single mothers in poverty? One of the most effective anti-poverty programs in the US is the Earned Income Tax Credit. The Census Bureau estimates that in 2010 alone, the EITC was responsible for lifting more than 5 million people out of poverty. And we know from research that this is one of the most effective programs to get single mothers into the labor market, get them into the labor market, earn them high incomes, and get them moving up the income ladder. So one of the proposals that we have in our study, in our paper, is to expand the EITC. This is not just our opinion. There are lots of people across the aisle talking about expanding the EITC, given its success in getting people out of poverty. So expand the EITC, expand the benefits going from the EITC to these single mothers. Expand the EITC also to childless adults. Currently, the benefits going to childless adults are very minimal. The bulk of the EITC payments go to single mothers with two or more children. But we need to change that. We need to expand the EITC so that non-custodial parents, men who are single men out in the labor market, if the objective is to increase employment, why not expand the EITC to these individuals as well? There's also the issue in the EITC that when the EITC benefits start being taken away, there are significant work disincentives that might arise. So people realize that if they work an extra hour, the benefits that they get coming out of the EITC may actually go down. And towards that end, we propose putting in a secondary earner deduction in the EITC in the phase-out regions, because when especially married women are out there in the labor market and the EITC is given to you on the basis of family income, then having those married women working out there reduces the income that's actually coming into the family because the benefits are going away at the same time. So we propose having a secondary earner deduction in the tax code that would help these married women stay out in the labor market and create the right incentives to work. Another issue that we face with single mothers in poverty is that even if they are in the labor market due to the EITC, what do they do about childcare? The childcare costs are significant. Recent reports suggest that the average cost of childcare is about $7,000. But the childcare tax credit that's in the tax code only subsidizes parents up to a maximum of 35% of $3,000 for a single child. So we propose expanding the childcare tax credit, because the childcare tax credit is actually a huge incentive to work. It's conditional on women working in the labor market. They can only claim the credit if they work in the labor market. And so expanding the size of the credit would allow these women to be out in the labor market, to take advantage of the subsidies. And there's tons of research out there suggesting that women on welfare who receive the childcare tax credit continue to be in the labor market longer than people who don't have access to these subsidies. The third issue with single mothers and poverty is that the majority of these single mothers are also teenagers. We have to address the issue of teenage pregnancy and the fact that these women are really not in a position to be working because they're in college, they have a child. What do they do? So having a media campaign, having a marketing campaign that talks about the problems associated with teenage pregnancy, that provides education, informing them about the economic outcomes maybe, and about the social outcomes and just the problems associated with having a child at that young an age would also be extremely helpful in avoiding teenage pregnancies. The second factor that is highly correlated with economic mobility is the labor market challenge or income inequality. We've been through the worst recession since the Great Depression, and we have record high levels of unemployment in the economy, which have contributed to rising levels of income inequality. And as I said, these high levels of income inequality will persist across generations if there is no mobility. So a low-income parent who is not able to invest in their children is likely to create generations of children in poverty, because we don't have the mobility that moves that child up through the income ladder. So how do we encourage labor force participation? As Mark mentioned in his opening remarks, having wage subsidy programs that match workers with employers is extremely successful, and I think an extremely good program to get people back into the labor market. We have a huge problem with not just the current unemployed, but the long-term unemployed. People have been out of jobs for longer than a year. We can sustain them on unemployment compensation, but at the end of that period, when the compensation goes out, how do we get them matched with how do we get them matched with an employer? Because employers, we know, are not going to be willing to hire these people who have faced skill attrition. There was an interesting study where somebody sent out resumes to employers where they said, oh, we've been long-term unemployed for so many months. And there was a statistically significant, in economists speak, difference between those people getting callbacks for interviews and people who did not have that on their CVs. So we know that there's a huge problem with the long-term unemployed. We need to match these workers to employers through wage subsidy programs, which have been effective at getting them back into the labor market, at training them, and providing them the right skills that they need to start working again. In fact, there's an interesting program, a jobs training program that's being tried out in Wisconsin, called the Wisconsin Fast Forward Initiative, where employers are developing customized job training for people that they're pulling out of the pool of long-term unemployed. The government is subsidizing this program, and basically in the first 6 months, the employers will get funding from the government to train these workers, to get them working with them, and then at the end of that period, those workers basically become full-time employees at that organization. So we need new initiatives to address the labor market challenges. We need programs that will actually place people into the job market rather than simply extend their dependence on welfare. Also we want to talk about apprenticeship programs and training opportunities for youth. So talking about people going straight from school to the labor market, easing that transition. We need apprenticeship programs, we need youth training programs that will ease that transition, that will get students matched to employers even before they graduate, even before they're out there, unemployed in the labor market. And finally, the most important issue that out there is the investment in education. The reason we're seeing these huge skills gap in the labor market currently is because we don't have enough people with the right education, with the right investment in skills. Now, if you look at dropout rates from high school for low-income individuals or for low-income students drop out of high school at 5 times the rate of middle-income families or students. How do we address that challenge? We provide a proposal in our paper about giving financial incentives to individuals to complete high school. So we know that financial incentives work for education. There is lots of research out there saying that when parents and children get financial incentives, cash rewards for completing certain tasks, for reading, for math, for achieving certain test scores, they do better. So having a financial incentive maybe to complete high school, which we know is highly correlated with mobility, which is highly correlated with your outcomes in the labor market, could be an interesting pilot project to study, could be an interesting program to target at high-risk, low-income individuals who might otherwise not see the benefits of high school. Also, similarly for college, we know that the Pell Grant program is successful at targeting low-income individuals, but again, the research out there suggests that not enough people avail of it. There are administrative difficulties to completing the financial aid form. People are not aware of how much of the grant that they can get. So, simplifying the process, currently about 7% of the payments go to people above 250% of the poverty line. So targeting it better towards just the very needy could also be extremely successful at getting these people into college. And finally, talking about TANF programs, we should have an eligibility requirement in the TANF programs that the school-age dependents be enrolled in school. Currently, 15 states do not have that. So you can take advantage of TANF without requiring that the dependents, the children in your family, actually be going to school. And we should change that if we really believe that education investments are important. So I'm going to end there, but in general, I think we have a lot of good programs out there. We have good federal programs. We're spending about $800 billion a year on anti-poverty programs, but I think we need better targeting. We need more simplification. We need more transparency so that people know which programs they're eligible for and take advantage of them. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and I really appreciate the mix of suggestions you've given us to high policy kinds of strategies to local level strategies. So I think we'll come back and talk a little bit more about that. So Ida, talk to us about the role of assets and savings and financial capability to economic mobility.
Yeah, sure. I'm going to actually try to abbreviate my comments a little bit because I know the conversation is going to be so interesting and iterative among us. So I liked that we started with the focus on the war on poverty, and I think what struck a lot of folks in the assets field, which I'll explain in a minute, about the conversations at the 50-year mark of the war on poverty was how much the set of solutions hadn't actually expanded or changed much. And I think that in some ways what I'm going to try to talk about here is that we have an incredible legacy that cannot be dismantled. That policy, social policy in the 20th century wove a safety net that really dealt with, the second line. After he said the unconditional war on poverty, LBJ said, that the next piece was that too many Americans live on the outskirts of hope, that our test is to replace their despair with opportunity. And I think that the 20th century legacy is really reducing despair, the abject, extremes of poverty, and creating that floor. And we also began to think about building the ladder, but the ladder that we did build had to do primarily with education and employment training. And there's new complexity in the financial marketplace and the way that our financial lives intersect with the rest of the ways that we have to navigate life that mean that we're actually missing entire segments of policy that help us get the outcomes we're seeking from the investments that we're making. So if the 20th century was about really the safety net, the 21st century is about really expanding how we conceptualize a ladder that really does create mobility strategies. And maybe not even a ladder, think of a jungle gym. There's got to be ways to navigate sideways. Everything's not linear in this space. Our organization, CFED, really emerged from our founder, Bob Friedman's recognition that the policy framework really was lacking in some ways in terms of the ladder of opportunity conversation. And his fundamental kind of driving force was that people everywhere in America have more capacity than opportunity, and that if we focus only on their consumption, a definition of well-being that is about consumption, we miss the real value to the economy of seeing low-income folks as producers, of seeing them as contributing to economic growth, and seeing them having a stake in that economy, and a way to invest in the aspirations they have, like all of us have for our kids, as fundamental to thinking about creating that growth paradigm where mobility and reduction in the disparities in mobility can really start happening for low-income communities. So it was when Bob and CFED's work kind of intersected with the work of a young scholar in the 1990s, Michael Sheridan, who wrote a book called Assets and the Poor, that some really interesting new experimentation started to emerge. And the premise in Michael Sheridan's book was that assets matter both economically and socially in ways that income doesn't. And that it's not just about individual gumption, it's actually about the institutions and the infrastructure that's in place that determines who builds assets and who doesn't. And I love comparing this with the new, and juxtaposing this with the new information coming out, controversial it is, from Thomas Piketty's book, showing that returns to wealth are empirically, over time, showing a greater return than returns to income, and that inequality widens unless you think about policies that address wealth inequality in addition to income inequality. So that's some of the theoretical underpinning of how experiments in both policy and program started to look at wealth access and savings and investment strategies that complement income and consumption strategies. Some of the research, I don't need to repeat a lot of it. I think the mobility research from Pew and from Urban is really helpful in some of the kind of key pieces that I always try to frame this with is that I love that Pew has started talking about stickiness at the ends, but I have just as interesting a question about why isn't the middle sticky? And I think that sometimes we conflate middle class with middle income. And so we just assume that when you're middle income, you've got it figured out. The reality is when we look at the data, almost half of America is, one paycheck away from not making ends meet. So the issues of economic vulnerability and the income volatility that goes way beyond what we traditionally describe as low-income, moderate-income households. So, when one of the early studies Pew did on economic mobility was showing that two families, both solidly in the middle income bracket, within a generation, over nearly 50% of African American households, kids, had moved to the bottom income bracket versus 16% of white households. And so there's something more than income explaining what made the middle sticky or not. And we think that assets and the social networks that also have assets and the level of that kind of connectivity is part of what would explain stickiness in the middle. And part of what's missing in terms of our social policy is how do we connect these incredibly important stabilizing programs with the things that create stickiness so that when you can save and invest and when others can save and invest in your own aspirations, when you get to the middle in terms of income, you don't get knocked back by the first wave, be it a health issue or a job loss that happens. So I think what's missing between the conversation of stability and mobility is resilience. And what are the policies that we really are talking about that create resilience in households? I think some other research that's really exciting, it speaks to this family structure situation. So there was a really interesting dissertation and additional research going on that maybe we have the cart and the horse confused, right? There's actually, in some of the research that's coming out, more explanatory value in small amounts of asset ownership for males. That explains away more of the marriage gap between African American and white males than incarceration, employment, and other aspects of what kind of are the kind of causal ideas combined. So it's interesting that just a vehicle ownership or even $300 in savings reduce this gap by 30 to 50% in between folks. So there's calculated reasons, and we're seeing this now in terms of millennials and Gen Xers extending the time when they actually move into household formation because of the amount of student debt there. So it's not in just one class, and it's not in just one income bracket. There are fundamentally strategic financial calculus going on in people's decisions about household formation. So when the Fatherhood Initiative or any of the other initiatives, kind of a marriage initiative, all of those things, one of the things we've been really working with HHS on is kind of figuring out how do you integrate basic financial capability and financial management and opportunities for real savings and investment into those types of things a priori as one of the fundamental aspects. And I think the other part that we continue to prove, and it's been through some of the rigorous research of HHS that's done this, is that we often think there has to be a linear way, that first people need income, and then we can build assets. And I think that what the data show is that given the right opportunity, and given the right structure, and given the right incentive, low-income families will save. They want to save. They'll save at rates higher in percentage than even middle-income families. And when you ask them why, they say the same thing that anybody in our own family say. They say it's the price you pay for hope. It's the price you pay to get your kids to a better place than where you're at. So we know that these programs can work, and then you come up with, well, what makes them work better? And I think a lot of our ideas in terms of policy is not creating a whole new set of policies that are in a new silo, right? The idea here is how do you leverage the existing platforms, employment platforms, social policy platforms, tax policy platforms, education platforms. How do you infuse into those the strategies we're learning actually help people become more financially capable? It connects a lot with the executive function conversation we've been talking about. Just a couple of examples here. would be, in terms of stability policies, it really is integration of thinking about access to banking and thinking about just pulling a credit score as part of an employment intake process. You know, one of the things that's a real barrier to employment, even as people acquire the skills these days, is that it's become de rigueur to require a credit report as part of condition of employment. Well, 40% of the country doesn't have a credit report. 60% of those who do have a subprime credit report. We're creating barriers that needn't exist until we have research that actually shows that there's some correlation between your credit score and your ability to perform the job. And we don't have that research. So that's a policy that's been put in place by a corporate policy that's been put in place that is actually creating a lot of barriers to the things that we're doing in our other strategies that could help people get ahead. So this integration idea, this understanding of things is really important. I'd say in terms of resilience, the whole question here is this opportunity to think about how do you bounce back from economic shocks? You know, how do you do that? So in that sense, you know, and how do you incent people to save and invest for these emergency funds? So this is where Urban has some great research, right? When they looked at, Signa Mary, who might be here, and Caroline Ratcliffe, looked at some great information about does savings help low-income households weather economic shocks? And the data was that I think it was $4,000 worth of savings in a low-income household enabled that household to weather an economic shock and stay kind of on the track, as well as people in the next third income bracket. So the savings piece really did have an actual quantifiable ability to help with that resilience. Eliminating asset limits is a key issue. So, you know, again, when people are being served by public programs, we, you know, have a sense that, that they have to spend down their assets. And for us, we think this is a little bit fundamentally unfair. We actually spend $500 billion on asset policy in this country as well, but it's pretty invisible. It's embedded in the tax code. It's tax deductions and deferrals for families who have a tax liability to be able to itemize and, you know, save money when they invest in a 529 or a 401k or a home mortgage deduction or differential rates for capital gains. We spend a huge amount. We actually don't get a lot of new net savings out of that because there's a lot of kind of rent seeking that's going on with that. So we say that, okay, households with means get welfare policy that's about building assets. Households without means actually get penalized for saving. We can complete disincentives to saving, and we actually completely eviscerate their ability to bounce back on their own by making them spend down all of those savings before they're able to go for help. So food stamps, TANF are real opportunities to eliminate asset limits. They already did it with ARA, which is fantastic. And SSI is another big area where it's never been indexed to inflation. $2,000 of assets is all you get. It's a huge disincentive to work. Huger than a lot of other things when you actually talk to people on to SSI about why they're not moving forward with some of the opportunities that they have in front of them. I'd say that in terms of mobility, this is where some of the most exciting strategies that we really do need to think about investing in greater ways come forth. First off, there's our own ability to, you know, in terms of policy, just reauthorize and modernize the Assets for Independence work program because it is the only federally funded program that does match the savings of low-income households to save for retirement, to save for a small business, to save for a home, to save for education. It matches them dollar for dollar. It's skin in the game, and it's a beautiful strategy that we know can work. And there's always uncertainty around it, so reauthorization is an important piece there. Helping families save, incenting and facilitating both emergency savings, expanding the saver's credit, making it both refundable and expanded would be great. And now Treasury, very exciting about the new retirement security bond, MyRA, really making sure that that pilot goes well. That's another exciting piece right now. That goes to the whole idea about making employment an actual success, not just for income, but for wealth building, which is how the majority of Americans build wealth in this country, is by having a quality job that includes a 401k or access to retirement savings that's incented. And then finally, I think one that's dear to our hearts and is getting a lot of play right now is the opportunity for children's savings. This idea that parents may often do for their kids what they won't do for themselves, and the idea that if you start investing early and you have this vehicle of a savings account that is dedicated to college, we do know that if that account is in the kid's name, the amount of wilt that the family has in terms of giving up on college early reduces. That kids, there's an often quoted statistic that kids are 4 to 6 times more likely to attend and complete college if they have a savings account in their own name. And again, there's this asset effect that's a real outsized effect. It doesn't have to be a lot of money. Even $500 increased the college going of low-income kids by 3 times with Willie Elliott's research. So there's children's savings programs exploding around the country. There's universal children's savings now in the city of San Francisco and Cuyahoga County. There's state universal programs in Maine, and they've just rolled it out in Nevada, and there's a number of other states going on, and there's federal policy around these issues as well. So lots of opportunities to think about how to integrate asset building strategies as another piece of the puzzle.
Thank you, Ida. And I really appreciate that a lot of the work that you and your folks are doing focuses on the positive, I think. I think one of the things we often talk about, what are the deficiencies and what's not there, but when we're talking about assets, we see that maybe that's a positive factor that may make the difference for certain groups of folks to move up and out. So I think that's really worth reflecting on. You mentioned Thomas Piketty's book, The Capital in the 21st Century, and I believe I've seen that that this book is sold out. Harvard University Press is having to reprint it. I think it might be this thick. It's a very deep book on economics and touches on this subject. And I wonder if you all might just sort of react for a moment about, there's obviously something going on when a book such as that, they're projecting sales of 200,000, which is way over any other book that Harvard University Press has put out. What's going on that we could maybe tap into around this subject of wealth and mobility that might help us to be able to put forward policies and strategies that people are interested in?
Anybody else want to go first? Okay, well, I think the main thing, again, I think the underlying premise of the book, which I will, not get quite right, and plenty of other people here are far more expert in this work than us, but the basic look at empirical data across many industrialized countries over the last couple of hundred years, and the data's sketchy, right? I mean, wealth data is hard in this country to come by, let alone, 100 years ago across industrialized countries. But there is, the pattern that emerges is that the actual overall return to growth in the country is actually eclipsed by returns to capital, and that actually was a little bit invisible to us, anybody living today, because post-World War II was actually, if you think about what happened in World War II in Europe, where most of industrialized world was, there was a huge destruction of wealth. And so we didn't see the kind of pattern of intensifying wealth inequality because there was actually this huge event that equalized wealth issues for a little while. So it became kind of blurred even as the Great Recession was crafting a war on policy, and even after the war on poverty in the 60s and the Great Depression earlier on with a focus on that. So I think that the combination of Michael Sheridan's assessing of an asset-based theory of well-being being somewhat compelling, with now empirical data that shows that yes, in fact, returns to growth do grow over time, and that he's pretty dire in the book, right? He kind of thinks that if left undone, this will eventually, the level of inequality will undermine democracy, will undermine our ability to hang together as societies, and is not a kind of a basis for work. So I do think that for us, it puts front and center in the inequality conversation, wealth as well as income, which I think was missing as part of the dynamic that we have to address going forward.
So I think Thomas Piketty's book echoes his earlier work, he's done a lot of work on income inequality with Emmanuel Saez. And their basic conclusion is, well, just as we are seeing concentrations of income at the top, we're also seeing concentrations of wealth at the top. This is not something that's specific to the US, this is a global phenomena. And the reason this is happening is because rates of growth, the return to capital is growing at a faster rate than the return to the economy or the rates of growth in the economy. Of course, there's a lot of questions now about the data, so I'm not going to speculate on that. But the basic prescription now is what the basic prescription was for the income inequality data, which is let's have a really high tax rate on the rich. You can do it on incomes, you can do it on capital. We want a global wealth tax. We need all the countries coordinating to get a global wealth tax. My issue with having really high rates of taxation, and this is again, work that I've done before, is, if the idea is to get really high revenues from those high rates of taxation, there is really not substantive research to suggest that you would get them. I mean, we have a huge behavioral response in the sense of, how do people respond to high tax rates? Do you really see the revenues coming in when you raise, in one of their papers, I think they actually suggest a tax rate for the US for about 75%. Nobody wants to go back to that time when we had high marginal tax rates of 75%. So advocating something like that today is not practical. It's not realistic, but it does get to I guess it gets to the ideology, which is that we need to get more out of the rich. And the issue is that we're already we have high rates of taxation relative to the rest of the world. We're getting about 70% of just federal income tax revenues come from, I think, the top 15 to 20% of the population. So I think there's a limit to how much we can use tax policy as a means of redistribution. So our focus has been, we can argue endlessly about what the ideal rate of taxation should be, but we need to address the policies that directly target low-income individuals. I think we get much more bang for the buck by going after federal programs, by making them more effective, by talking about some of the policies that I'm talking about here, rather than making the conversation entirely about taxing the rich or about global concentrations of wealth and income.
So I think that the incredible sales of Piketty's book, in addition to helping him ascend to the 1%, you don't speak to a large, you desire to study inequality of wealth or income in the U.S., although that would be nice. But I think it speaks more to the frustration of lots of folks in society coming out of the Great Recession and the really not so great recovery, that it's just tough to get ahead. And we see, the income stagnation at the middle, income stagnation at the bottom. And at the very top, we're seeing, yesterday the S&P 500 hit a record high, right? The folks at the top are doing very well. They've come roaring out. They were hit hard in the recession, but they came roaring out. And so it's in that context that this book on income inequality, wealth inequality hit. And I think it speaks to the idea that we're growing, the escalator is going up, but we're not on it. The tide is rising, our boat's still in dry dock. And I think that's the popularity of the book. I think it's really a question of how do we get the benefits of growth to be distributed more equally?
Thank you. So kind of following up on that, Greg, you talked about investments at different times in the life cycle, and early childhood, young adult, entering work. And I wonder if you could talk a little, I think that's something that folks can understand and appreciate. Are there points that are more important than others if we have to make decisions about strategies or policies? Are there different periods in that life cycle that we think are more critical that we should be paying attention to?
So that's a really hard question. I'll try to answer it without taking up the rest of the time. So there are, I think the 0 to 3 period, getting kids off to a good, healthy start is fairly crucial and may be the most important time, but it's not the only time for an intervention. And, we've seen study after study that shows, okay, this program raises reading scores at, for 5-year-olds, but by the time they're 10 years old, the effect is phased out. Then you start seeing studies, but, kids who are in this program where the effects faded out look better at high school graduation for some reason. What that says to me is that we don't fully understand the mechanisms by which different interventions are affecting kids at different life stages. So an intervention, that improves reading scores for a while and then seems to dissipate may impart other skills that show up later. And so we really need a longer-term perspective on how we invest in children pays off, not just at subsequent life stages, but all the way through into adulthood, because it can be in complex ways that we don't fully understand. Also, it's hard to move the needle. We talked about how kids have so many disadvantages. Any one program at any one life stage can only have a limited impact. So you can think of it as like building a bridge, right? If you build a bridge halfway across the river, you're not going to get too many people across. I mean, you'll get them a little way, maybe they can swim the rest of the way. But you really got to finish the bridge. And you got to build the bridge wide enough that people can walk across, and you got to build it high enough so it doesn't wash out when the river rises. So there's no one program, one life stage that's going to make it. You're going to have a sustained effort.
Thank you. Aparna, I wonder if you might talk a little bit about the issue that a lot of researchers have brought to the forefront about place, and that different areas of the United States seem to promote mobility over others, and what we're learning about that, and the issue of integration and those kinds of things.
Yeah, thank you, Jeannie. That was actually something that I wanted to touch on as well. One of the findings from the research is that when you look at mobility across different states, or even across different cities in the U.S., cities with greater segregation tend to see less economic mobility. Now, segregation can be in terms of race, and it's highly correlated with income as well. So you see pockets of poverty as distinct from where the higher income individuals live. And that has an effect on mobility because, first of all, if you talk about the children in these poor pockets, they don't have access to good public schools because all the funding is coming through the local residents. They're low income. You don't have good school choice. So some of the policy ideas there were, well, how do we develop place-based initiatives to improve or engage in community betterment projects so that we either improve these poor pockets and get the rich to move in or the middle class to move in? Because separation of the poor from the middle actually tends to be a greater sort of ingredient towards affecting mobility than separation from the super rich. Because you get access to good quality peers, you get the right interactions, you get the right aspirations. So one of the suggestions was, well, do we engage in community betterment projects? Do we engage in sort of more transportation, address the transportation issue so that people from these communities can go work or go to school in different areas? We found a lot of research that found mixed effects of these programs. I mean, you can have community betterment projects, but you don't actually see people moving in. If they do move in, rents go up in those areas, and so it actually drives the poor out. So what we suggest is if the issue is school choice, if the fact is that children in these areas tend to have access to poorer quality schools, why not have open enrollment in the district? And there are now lots of experiments around the US which suggest that if you have open enrollment in a district, you put your first three, let's say, schools that you want to go to, the top quality schools, and children who get access to those schools, those high, their first choice schools, actually tend to do better on reading, on test scores, and on math and things like that. So there is some literature out there suggesting that having more school choice could counteract some of these disadvantages of growing up in poorer areas. Again, the other issue is, again, the college dropout rates. Areas with poor mobility tend to be areas where children drop out more from high school. They're poorer job opportunities. So those are some of the issues that I've already spoken about. But having sort of the right financial incentives for children to stay in school, having the right labor market policies to get the adults back into the labor market could address the mobility issues as well.
Thank you. So Ida, I wonder if there's anything related to to just, as you mentioned, a small amount of assets can really make a difference. And I think in preparing for today, I know I reviewed some of the material that all of you have written, and that one factor for upward mobility is having a little bit of asset, a little bit higher education, those kinds of things. And so, finding that is not present in many families, what additional thoughts do you have about how we might promote that?
Yeah, I think some of the most interesting work right now is about, there's no, we're not saying a little bit of assets makes all the difference in terms of your long-term mobility, right? But there is some sense of an asset effect, which is something about the psychological effect that assets have that is evident in some of the research, and how that's a little bit different than the psychology of, debt reduction, for example, So when people are making seemingly very unsmart decisions about paying off debt, or about building savings, even as they still have a lot of debt, I think a lot of what's going on there is just kind of this individual kind of desire to think future orientation, and that small amounts of assets actually give you the tool to start having future-oriented conversations with people. So I think that the part that's really exciting these days is especially the experimentation and the pilots that are going on in human service delivery programs, understanding that the on-ramps to even getting somebody there, that you're talking about sometimes extremely vulnerable populations who the idea of homeownership might not be even a thought for them right now, but starting where they are and figuring out what are the tools that continue to build the bridge, right? And again, making sure that they're not happening in a vacuum, but they're actually seamlessly integrated in some ways into the kinds of programs that are already existing. Mark mentioned transitional employment programs, subsidized employment programs as an example. So some recent research we just released with the Department of Treasury was the Assessing Financial Capability Outcomes pilot. It happened in New York City. It was the Office of Financial Empowerment and the Parks Opportunity Program, which is one of the largest subsidized employment programs in the country for individuals leaving TANF. And basically what happened with this project is that we, working with the University of Wisconsin Center for Financial Security, built into the orientation into the subsidized employment process a few additional steps that weren't kind of optional, they just looked normal. There was some light touch financial education that talked to the individuals in orientation about the value of direct deposit, the value of being banked, the kind of additional hassle factors that reduces for you in terms of going to cash your check at the end of a long week, an additional bus trip. They also thought, and I thought this was really smart, to have that information delivered by former participants in the program. And those former participants rewrote the entire curriculum to be meaningful. And then what happened, then we had the bank on site, right, to do this piece. What happened is that a rate of 16% banked went to almost 56% banked, just in the orientation process alone. So the idea of leveraging employment programs, and that just gave a hook. The part that was next was that we actually randomized access to financial empowerment centers, which is one-on-one financial coaching for folks just coming and starting where you are. And we randomized it by, these are real live programs going on, so all of the problems with our randomized control trials exist, as always. But the reality was, after getting, we had, the treatment group enrolled, and we followed them for a year, and we followed all aspects of their work. This was an incredibly vulnerable population. 20% were homeless, all sorts of things. We found out a lot of things. We found out that even with only a third of the treatment group actually accessing that financial empowerment coaching, there was still statistically significant findings at the end of the year in terms of reduction in past due debt, right? So when you're actually talking about some of the issues that are barriers to economic mobility are pretty easily fixed. Some of the larger issues that we as Americans are facing are that debt to income ratios have gone from 57% in the 80s to 150% in 2007. We're so over-leveraged, and who's over-leveraged is totally flipped, right? So lowest income households are actually the highest leveraged households in the US now versus it used to be the other way around. So if the biggest issue for them at that point is reducing debt and helping them make those decisions, and that begins to create inroads to, I can do this, that's great. And then you parlay that into an opportunity at tax time when you're getting the EITC to have somebody do a split refund, to put some of that in savings for emergency. And there's a national replication going on right now called Save USA that MDRC is doing, looking at the fact that, large percentages, 50, 60% of the individuals who are taking those savings accounts are, and getting it matched if they keep it in for a year, they're making $17,000 a year. They're saving it the entire year. They're rolling it into the next year. They're using it for exactly the kinds of things you're wanting. And it also is creating this hook to, oh, if I can save for that, maybe I can save for this. And so again, maybe it creates that seed of aspiration. It's a little long, sorry.
No, thank you. So I'm going to ask folks, if you have a question, to please proceed over to a microphone and get in line to ask our panelists a question, or if you have a certain area that you'd like to hear more about, to let us know. While people are doing that, I think I'll just mention how helpful I think it is to hear the kinds of strategies and policy levers that have been articulated today. I know that we have many TANF administrators and other folks from state offices and state human service departments, and so I know you may be looking for a certain level of intervention that you could push forward. I know we have community-based organizations in the room, and so hearing, about ideas about education or prevention of teen pregnancy or intervening at different life cycles might be helpful. So do we have any questions from the audience? I can't see. Hi. Oh, okay, here. Please state your name and where you're from and ask your question.
Sure. My name is Celeste Ritchie. I'm at the U.S. Department of Labor. And I guess I'm trying to figure out how to frame this, but in a lot of these kinds of discussions, aside from tax policy, I feel like we assume that the solution resides only in the population that we're focusing on, of low-income individuals and families. And I'm just wondering if we could reframe that sometimes and sort of take a different lens that, there's so much evidence of discrimination in the workplace. Employers, seeing two identical resumes with different names on them and making different choices, even college professors offering different mentoring opportunities to people that they perceive to be part of their group or similar to them. So I'm just wondering what is the role, and how do we look for solutions and behavior change in high-income people as part of the solution to this? Thanks.
Somebody like to take that?
So I really can't see who I'm talking to. There, all right. I think that you've hit on a very important issue that we've sort of glossed over, which is the issue of race. And, one of the issues that Arpana talked about was the how, where you grow up, the communities that are more unequal are the ones that have the least mobility, and it's not a coincidence that those are also disproportionately non-white communities. What can we do? Recognize that even if overt discrimination has decreased, there's certainly an undercurrent of discrimination, maybe that we don't even understand at our own levels. The last couple of months, we saw the frankly reprehensible comments coming from the owner of the Los Angeles Clippers. We saw the rancher in Nevada make statements that just, suggest there's this undercurrent of maybe racism, maybe misunderstanding, or insensitivity to the racial issues. We can, sort of a matter of law, be vigilant and enforce equal opportunity laws that are on the books. But more importantly, I know that we've always talked about having a conversation about race, but sort of understand that we are not in a post-racial society yet, and we've got to be sensitive to it, even as sort of affirmative action guidelines start falling by the wayside at universities. So I don't have an answer, but I think you're right to bring out the problem.
Any others?
So, I mean, you've talked about race, but I think the other issue that we're hearing a lot in the media about is the discrimination against women in the labor market and the wage pay gap. So whatever the research out there suggests that, you know, the raw wage gap is about 23 cents. If you look at, if you control for things like, you know, women working the same hours, having the same qualifications, and so on, the gap goes down a lot. But I think the larger issue is, why are women making these choices? And this goes not just to women at the top of the income ladder, but, you know, at all income levels. And we have another study coming out which talks about mobility just for women, and what are the, you know, there's some things that you can, that we can legislate and we can talk about policy changes, but a lot of it may be just driven by social customs and mores, and that we cannot really change. But you know, to the extent that we can reduce some of that discrimination by addressing policies that look at you know, providing childcare to working women, low-income working women, to providing sort of the right incentives to be in the labor market through reforming tax programs and the EITC and so on. I think some of that discrimination can be addressed, and that discrimination could, you know, could also be up the income ladder as well as at the low-income level. So I feel like, until we understand the statistics better, until we know, you know, what we're dealing with, I think it's tough to talk about. But you're absolutely true that it happens at all income levels.
I think I think it's a good question, and I appreciate, Aparna, that you also brought out the issue with women, and both of the aspects of this, I think, have been addressed really well in a couple of reports. Maria Shriver's Women on the Brink, I think, does a great job of sort of making the case for why we need to change policy and support women, especially low-wage working women. And then All in Nation, which is a report from Policy Link and Center for American Progress, I think does a great job of demonstrating that for this country to thrive moving forward, we're going to have the gifts, and we have to use the gifts and talents of everybody. We cannot have anybody, no matter race, gender, sex, on the sidelines. We've got to have everybody reaching their full capacity if we are going to continue to really thrive. So I would suggest that if you'd like to think a little bit more on this, both of those reports are really helpful on this subject. So I'm going to move to our next question, because I don't want to leave any questions unanswered.
Hi, good morning. My name is Sydney Fong. I'm also at ACF in the Office of Refugee Resettlement, and my question is kind of along the same vein. I'm interested in hearing how you all envision the policies that you all talked about being implemented in immigrant and refugee communities, and how that looks different for those communities.
Ida, do you have any examples for?
Yeah, I mean, I think in terms of specifically in refugee communities, you do end up with a place dynamic in some cases where trusted intermediaries and what they're doing and how they're addressing issues. You know, what's the data to help understand, from our perspective, some of the financial insecurity drivers in the population? And so there's certainly ORR's, you know, Individual Development Account Program. New York, again, did a really interesting immigrant financial services study that did do some, and we just did an entrepreneur financial service study because the rates of entrepreneurship are so high in immigrant communities. I think, you know, some of the policy ideas at the local level that have been interesting in terms of addressing this ability to withstand shocks and invest, save and invest. There's, you know, programs that actually help to create citizen loan programs, right? So match savings toward the costs of citizenship. There are lending circles in terms of thinking about, they're called cestas and lending circles where everybody's saving. The difference these days with an incredibly useful lending circle is that the facilitator, Mission Asset Fund in this case, is actually reporting on-time payment to a credit bureau, so you're actually building a credit score. So you're getting to start having a financial identity in the work. So there's some pieces like that that are important. I think the other part of this in terms of the role of policy at a state or local or federal level is that, two things I would just draw out in a broad way would be, on the one hand, we've talked a lot about the important investments that need to be made, additional investments, and we'd be remiss if we didn't actually identify that actually the percentage of a discretionary budget that's there when new elected officials walk in the door is actually non-existent, right? There is no ability for lawmakers today to make bold investments in the future economic productivity in different ways than right now because of all of the prior constraining ways that we've tied up investment over time in terms of how the budget is growing. So I think that that investment side of policy needs to be looked at through some different lenses. I think the other part is to understand that policy that is more malleable right now, both at the local and state and federal level, is that it can be shaped in ways that does help shape markets and shape different institutions in terms of their own behavior. So we shouldn't just think about our policy in terms of shaping the behavior of individuals. We should be thinking about how it shapes the behavior of institutions. And in that sense, I do think that when you think about the quality of employment, another great book on women, and it goes in a similar vein here. Mariko Chang wrote a book called Shortchanged, looking at wealth inequality with women. There's a certain expansion of wealth inequality with African Americans and Latinos as well. She talks about the wealth escalator and how some people are on it. And I think about that going 5 floors down here, right? Imagine if it was just stairs, or if actually there was, you didn't even know where the stairwell was, it would be pretty hard to go there versus somebody who's able to just get on an escalator or an elevator and zoom up and not even think about the work it takes. So, I think the role of policy is important. I think the role of fundamental research, understanding the drivers of financial insecurity, and that the kind of pat answers of, well, we need more training, which are very important, but understanding how they actually intersect with the real opportunity, and if there's a piece of missing pieces that are really customized to specific populations is important to think about.
Thank you. Other questions? Okay. So I started. Is there one?
Yep.
Oh, okay.
Sorry.
Great. Thank you.
I didn't get up in time. My name is Dave Dugalecki. I'm from the State of New York TANF agency, the Office of Temporary and Disability Assistance. And Aparna said something earlier about we get more bang from the buck, doing programs as opposed to changing tax policy or something like that. And it made me think, where do the bucks come from? And more specifically, I guess my question to the panel is, in the context of, shrinking it down into the context of ACF-funded programs and the resources that are made available to the states through those, what would you suggest states do to redirect that kind of funding from the things we're doing now to other sorts of policies that might be more helpful?
Right. Go ahead. Yeah, that's a really good question. So when we talk about expanding the EITC, the biggest question we get is, well, where is the money going to come from? Expanding the EITC, already we spend about $35 billion a year. We expand it, we extend it to childless adults. Where is the money going to come from? And I guess our approach has been that, well, we're spending, there are tons of government programs out there that we're spending $800 billion on these anti-poverty programs. Paul Ryan recently sort of did a tabulation of all of these poverty programs, and there have been a lot of reform suggestions saying we don't need so many programs, we need to simplify the system, and that we could actually get savings from doing away with some of the programs, combining them more efficiently with other programs that exist. So we don't have a clear-cut answer to how much we could save by doing that, but it seems that you could get a lot of savings by sort of doing away with the maze of programs that exist today, targeting them more efficiently. We did some research at AEI looking at just the tax credit programs. We quantified, I think, the top 6 or 7 tax credit programs, and we found that there was a lot, I think about 30% of the money was going to people earning above $100,000. So you have the child credit program, the child tax credit, not the child and care dependent tax credit, but the child tax credit program, which is basically something that even higher income individuals are eligible for. And there are lots of these tax credit programs within the current tax code, which are not effectively targeted. They exist because it's tough to do away with them. But if the real need is to target the money towards the poor, then I think you could get significant savings from reforming these programs, making them more targeted, and get the money out of that to shift it towards low-income programs.
Yeah, I think that if you go where the money is, and that's in the tax code, but ACF doesn't really control the tax code. But I do think that you're redirecting tax expenditures and maybe a useful thing, although Dave Camp's proposal has been not met with thunderous applause in Washington. Within ACF's framework, I think the idea of targeted skills training programs like HPOG, for example, are a useful point of emphasis in that it can, prepare. It's almost a two-generation approach. If you think about it, you're preparing mothers, TANF mothers, to take jobs in concert with local employers and local training providers, and then you get them into work, and that should have the attendant benefits for higher income, higher mobility, and benefits to the kids. I probably do have to say that the Urban Institute, in partnership with APT, is evaluating the HPOG program. But with that disclaimer, the general approach, I think, within ACF to skill development is where I'd like to see a lot of resources go.
Thank you. So just, I think that was a great closing question. I appreciate it. And as one who started their career in a local community action agency in Southwest Missouri, and then was a state official, and now works at ACF, I can certainly appreciate that it's not likely that a large infusion of money is coming for you to invest in new programs. But I think what the reality of today begs of all of us is to take the research that OPRE and others are doing and really think about what we're doing now and how to really increase the magnitude of results that we're achieving. And that may mean doing some things differently, tinkering around the edges, or it may be completely new strategies based on what the evidence says works. And so I think we really are moving into a time where it's much more important that we all look at the research and look at the evidence and use it to move forward. And so you all have a leg up on that because you're here at the REC conference this week, really getting exposed to some of the most current and cutting edge research that's out there. So you are all to be commended. You're doing exactly what you need to do, I think, in this day and age. So with that, I really want to thank our panelists. It's such an interesting discussion. I think that you all covered an amazing amount of ground in a very short time, and we appreciate it, and we encourage you to go out and do more of this work because we need to know what works and how to move the needle on this issue. Thank you very much.